For 12 years, my world was a 20-story glass building downtown. My universe was the corner office on the 17th floor. Not my office, of course. His. Mr. Harrison's. My life was defined by the steady, metronomic rhythm of his needs.
6 Uhr morgens Alarm.
7:15 a.m. train. 8 a.m. His coffee, black with 1/4 of a sugar packet, sitting on his desk, the steam just beginning to fade. My days were a symphony of spreadsheets, conference calls, and last-minute presentation tweaks. I was his senior project manager, a title that sounded important but really meant I was the architect of his success, the ghost in his machine. I didn't just manage his projects. I managed his life. I knew his wife's birthday, his son's allergies, the brand of scotch his most difficult client preferred. I sacrificed birthdays, holidays, the fragile beginnings of relationships, all laid at the altar of Harrison and Sterling. I believed in the mission. I believed in him. I saw him as a mentor, a titan of industry who had taken a chance on me, a quiet girl from a working-class neighborhood. He'd often say, "You're indispensable, Maria," and my heart would swell with a pride that felt like sunlight. That praise was my fuel. I lived on it. I ran on the fumes of his approval, convinced that my loyalty, my tireless dedication, would one day be rewarded with a seat at the table, not just a chair against the wall. My routine was my religion. The sterile scent of the office cleaner in the morning, the hum of the servers, the weight of my laptop in its worn leather bag, these were the sacred elements of my existence. I loved the pressure, the thrill of pulling off an impossible deadline. I loved the feeling of being essential. I loved that he depended on me. It made me feel seen, important. My identity was so deeply woven into that company, into his career, that I couldn't tell where I ended and the job began. It was a love affair in a way. Not with the man, but with the role I played in his world. I was the steadfast, invisible pillar holding up his grand cathedral. And I was content with that. I thought that was my purpose. The day it all shattered started like any other. A high-stakes conference call with the board and a potential new client from Frankfurt. It was a billion-dollar merger. My entire quarter had been dedicated to this single call. I had spent the last 72 hours without sleep, perfecting the data, anticipating every possible question, creating a presentation so seamless it looked like we'd been working on it for a year, not 3 months. I was in my small, adjacent office, monitoring the live feed on the company's internal channel, which was broadcast to all employees to promote transparency. A new company policy. I was listening to Mr. Harrison's voice, smooth and confident, as he walked them through my slides. He was brilliant, I thought. He took my data and made it sing. I felt a familiar surge of pride. We were a team. Then, during the Q&A, one of the German executives asked a particularly complex question about market projections over the next 20 years, a variable I hadn't explicitly covered because it was pure speculation. I saw Mr. Harrison's confident facade flicker for a fraction of a second. From my desk, I quickly typed a concise, brilliant answer into our private chat, complete with a data source he could cite. He glanced down at his screen. His shoulders relaxed. He cleared his throat and began to speak, reciting my words almost verbatim. He was incredible. He'd absorbed the information in seconds. The clients were impressed. The deal felt close. They were wrapping up, exchanging pleasantries. I leaned back in my chair, my body thrumming with adrenaline and exhaustion. I was about to close the feed when Mr. Harrison, believing the call was over, leaned back in his chair and laughed. He was talking to our COO, who was in the room with him. The line was still open. The red live icon was still glowing. His voice, now stripped of its corporate polish, was condescending and casual. "God, that was close," he said with a chuckle. The COO laughed with him. "That last question almost had you." Mr. Harrison waved a dismissive hand. "Please." I had it under control. Then came the words that stopped my heart. "Besides, you can't get bogged down in every little detail. You have to think big picture. That's what people like Maria are for. The worker bees. Women like her don't think, they just do. And thank God for that." He said it with such ease, such casual cruelty. It wasn't a moment of anger. It was, I realized with a sickening lurch, what he truly believed. In the live chat on the side of the screen, the scrolling comments from employees across the company abruptly stopped. There was just a void, a digital silence that was louder than a scream. I looked at my own reflection in the dark screen. The tired eyes, the pale skin. A woman who doesn't think. A worker bee. An automaton. My years of sacrifice, my intellect, my dedication, all of it reduced to a thoughtless, mechanical function in his mind. The shame was a physical force, a hot wave that washed over me, burning my skin, prickling my eyes. He hadn't just insulted me. He had erased me, live, in front of everyone I worked with. The pillar holding up his cathedral had crumbled into dust.
Naquele momento, meu chão desapareceu. Foi a dor mais profunda que já senti. Se você já passou por uma grande decepção e entende o que é ter o coração partido, por favor, curta este vídeo para eu saber que não estou sozinha nesta jornada.
The days that followed are a blur of gray. The company issued a formal apology for the technical glitch. Mr. Harrison sent a hollow, HR-approved email about his poor choice of words. I couldn't go back into that office. I couldn't face the pitying looks, the whispers, the knowledge that everyone had heard my professional execution. I took a leave of absence, which soon became a forced resignation with a severance package that felt more like hush money than compensation. The 20-story glass building that had been my world was now a monument to my humiliation. I would see it on the skyline and feel a physical pain in my chest. My life, once so structured and purposeful, became a vast, empty expanse of time. I'd wake up and the silence in my small apartment would be deafening, a stark contrast to the constant hum of the office. There were no emails to answer, no deadlines to chase, no problems to solve. There was just me and the crushing weight of my own worthlessness. I was a ghost in my own life. I'd apply for jobs, but my confidence was shattered. In interviews, I felt like a fraud. How could I sell myself as a competent project manager when my own mentor believed I couldn't even think? The rejection emails piled up, each one a confirmation of his assessment. My savings began to dwindle. I started eating once a day to make the money last. The crisp, tailored suits I used to wear hung in my closet like costumes from another life. My uniform now was sweatpants and an old t-shirt, a reflection of the shapelessness I felt inside. I was at the bottom of a well, and the light at the top seemed to be shrinking every day. My mother, worried, came to visit. She didn't say, "I told you so," but I could see it in her eyes. She'd always warned me about giving so much of myself to a job. One afternoon, she asked me to help her clear out some boxes from my grandmother's attic that had been stored in my closet for years. My grandmother, Nana, had passed away when I was a teenager. I barely remembered her, just a vague sense of a warm lap and a scent of lavender, and something else, something earthy and sweet. We opened a large, dark wooden chest. It smelled of cedar and thyme. Inside, beneath faded linens, were dozens of small, leather-bound journals and a collection of tiny glass vials, some still containing dark, viscous liquids. I picked up a journal. The pages were filled with my grandmother's elegant, looping script. But it wasn't a diary. It was filled with chemical formulas, notes on distillation, and poetic descriptions of scents. The memory of rain on hot asphalt, one entry read, followed by a list of components. Jasmine, patchouli, vetiver. I learned that my grandmother, a woman I remembered only for her baking, had been a nose, a perfumer. In her small village in Italy, she had created bespoke scents for people, a perfume to capture the joy of a wedding day, a scent to soothe a grieving widow, a fragrance to remind someone of a long-lost home. It was a family secret, a tradition that had died with her because my mother saw it as an old-world craft with no place in modern life. As I read, I felt a strange stirring inside me. These journals weren't just recipes. They were a testament to a different kind of intelligence. Not the cold, hard data of my corporate world, but a deep, sensory, emotional intelligence. The ability to translate a feeling into a chemical formula, to capture a memory in a bottle. It required chemistry, artistry, patience, and an immense capacity for empathy. It required profound thought. Tucked into the final journal, I found a small, pressed flower and a sentence written in Italian. My mother translated it for me.
Pensare con l'anima, she said softly.
To think with the soul. That was it. That was the tiny, fragile spark in the overwhelming darkness. The idea that there was more than one way to think. The idea that maybe, just maybe, I hadn't forgotten how. I started with the dregs of my severance pay. I bought a cheap starter kit online, a few essential oils, some beakers, and perfumer's alcohol. My small kitchen became my laboratory. The first few weeks were a disaster. My attempts at creating a simple lavender scent ended up smelling like cleaning fluid or bitter medicine. I was clumsy and impatient. I wanted the spreadsheet-like precision of my old life, a clear formula for success. But my grandmother's journals taught me that this was a different kind of work. It wasn't about crunching numbers, it was about listening. I had to learn the personality of each ingredient. Bergamot was a bright, cheerful shout. Sandalwood was a low, meditative hum. Jasmine was a seductive whisper in the dark. I spent hours, days, just smelling. I'd put a drop of oil on a testing strip and smell it every 10 minutes for hours, writing down how it changed, how it evolved. I was retraining my brain, teaching it a new language, one that had been dormant my whole life. My goal became singular, to recreate the scent of my Nana's garden as I vaguely remembered it. Lavender, yes, but also the rich, dark soil after a rain, the sweetness of sun-ripened tomatoes on the vine, and a hint of the lemon verbena she grew by the door. I failed over and over. I wasted precious ingredients. I cried in frustration, surrounded by mismatched, clashing smells. There were moments I was ready to give up, to concede that Mr. Harrison was right, that I was just a functionary, incapable of creation. But then I'd read Nana's words. Patience. The rose does not bloom in a day. I persevered. I studied the chemistry, learning about top notes, middle notes, and base notes, the architecture of a fragrance. I learned how some scents anchored others, how some could lift and brighten an entire composition. I started to think not in terms of spreadsheets, but in stories. What was the story of this garden? It started with a bright, sharp scent of a lemon verbena, the top note, then softened into the warm, floral heart of lavender and tomato leaf, the middle notes, and finally, it settled into the comforting, earthy scent of wet soil and oak moss, the base notes. After 6 months of relentless trial and error, I did it. I created a small vial of a fragrance I called Nana's Garden. I put a drop on my wrist. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in almost a year, I wasn't in my sterile apartment. I was a child again, safe and warm, in a place that felt like home. It was a small thing, a single vial of perfume, but it felt like the first real accomplishment of my life. I wore it everywhere. It was my secret armor. One day, I was sitting in a small cafe, trying to work up the courage to apply for another job, when a woman from a nearby table approached me. She looked to be in her late 60s, with kind but tired eyes. "I'm so sorry to bother you," she said, "but what is that beautiful scent you're wearing?"
I was so shocked I could barely speak.
I told her it was something I'd made myself, to remind me of my grandmother's garden. A shadow of sadness passed over her face. "I lost my husband last year," she confided, her voice barely a whisper. "We had a garden. It was his pride and joy. Your perfume, it smells like the mornings we used to spend out there." On impulse, I opened my bag, took out the small sample vial I always carried with me, and gave it to her. "Please," I said. "Take it." Her eyes filled with tears. She held the vial like it was a precious jewel. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've given me a piece of him back." Watching her walk away, I felt a shift inside me. My work, this strange new passion, had touched someone. It had eased a stranger's pain, even for a moment. It wasn't about closing a deal or hitting a quarterly target. It was about connection. It was about memory. It was about the soul. That day, I went home and, instead of opening a job portal, I created a simple website. I used my severance money to buy better ingredients and elegant little bottles. I started with just one scent, Nana's Garden. I wrote the story behind it, the story of my grandmother, of thinking with the soul. I didn't expect much, maybe a few sales to friends and family. But then, a small lifestyle blogger found my site. She bought a bottle and fell in love with the story as much as the scent. She wrote a post about the corporate drone who traded spreadsheets for soul. The story went viral. Suddenly, orders were flooding in. People weren't just buying perfume, they were buying a piece of my story, a piece of my heart. They wrote to me, telling me what Nana's Garden reminded them of, their own childhoods, their lost loved ones, their hopes for the future. I expanded my line, creating new scents based on memories and feelings. First rain, faded letters, Sunday morning. My tiny apartment became a bustling workshop. I was working harder than I ever had in my life, but it wasn't draining. It was energizing. I was no longer a ghost. I was a creator. I was building something that was entirely mine, from the ground up.
Foi ali, com as minhas próprias mãos, que comecei a reescrever a minha história. Deixei de ser a vítima e me tornei a autora do meu destino. Se a minha jornada de superação está te inspirando, inscreva-se no canal para acompanhar os próximos capítulos e fazer parte desta comunidade de recomeços.
2 years passed. My company, which I named Anima, the Italian word for soul, had grown beyond my wildest dreams. I had a small workshop now with 2 employees. My scents were being sold in boutiques across the country. I was interviewed for magazines. They always wanted to talk about my story, the dramatic shift from the corporate world to the artisanal one. I never named Mr. Harrison or his company. I never spoke about the humiliation. I simply said that I'd realized my definition of success had changed. I had put the past behind me, or so I thought. One afternoon, my assistant told me a man was here for a meeting I didn't remember scheduling. She said his name was Mr. Harrison. My blood ran cold. For a moment, I was back in that small office, the shame washing over me. But then I took a deep breath, inhaling the complex, beautiful sense of my own creation that filled the air. This was my world now. I was in control. I told her to send him in. He walked into my workshop and the change in him was startling. He looked older, grayer, and smaller than I remembered. His expensive suit seemed out of place among the dried flowers, the glass beakers, and the warm wood of my studio. He looked around, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "Maria," he said, as if he couldn't be sure it was me. I had no idea. "Anima Fragrances, this is you?" I didn't offer him a seat. I simply stood my ground, my hands resting on my workbench. "What can I do for you, Mr. Harrison?" He was clearly flustered. He launched into a rambling story about how Harrison and Sterling were looking for a unique, high-end corporate gift for their top clients for the holidays. Someone on his marketing team had suggested my company. He said he'd seen our brand, heard the buzz, but had never made the connection. He was here to propose a massive partnership, a deal worth more than my company made in a year. He laid out the proposal, the numbers, the exposure it would give my brand. It was the kind of deal the old Maria would have killed for. The old Maria would have seen it as the ultimate validation. But I wasn't the old Maria. I let him finish his entire pitch. I listened patiently as he spoke of synergy and brand alignment, using the same corporate jargon that had once been my native tongue. When he was done, he looked at me expectantly, a confident smile playing on his lips, the same smile he used to close deals. "Well," he said, "what do you think?" I was calm. The rage and hurt I thought I would feel simply wasn't there. In its place was a quiet, unshakable peace. "I think you were right about something, Mr. Harrison." I began, my voice even. He looked puzzled. "The woman who used to work for you, the one you talked about on that call, she didn't think." "Not really. She didn't think about what she wanted. She didn't think about her own worth. She only thought about your deadlines, your targets, and your success. You were her entire world, and she never once stopped to think if that world was good for her soul." I picked up a small bottle of a new scent I was developing. "That woman is gone. The woman standing in front of you thinks all day, every day. She thinks about chemistry and art. She thinks about how to turn a memory into a molecule. She thinks about how to bring comfort to a grieving widow and joy to a young bride. She thinks with her soul. And she thinks," I said, looking him directly in the eye, "that her soul is not for sale. We are not the right brand for you, Mr. Harrison." His smile vanished. He opened his mouth to argue, to negotiate, but he saw something in my eyes that made him stop. He saw a woman who didn't need his approval. He saw a woman who had built a world of her own, a world he couldn't touch. He simply nodded, turned, and walked out of my life for good. As the door closed behind him, I didn't feel a surge of victory or a desire for revenge. I just felt peace. I had faced my past not with anger, but with the quiet strength of my present. Today, my life is not defined by a glass tower or the approval of a powerful man. It's defined by the stories I get to tell, the connections I get to forge, and the beauty I get to create with my own 2 hands. I found my purpose not in climbing a corporate ladder, but in digging deep into my own roots, into a legacy I never knew I had. The greatest betrayal of my life became the catalyst for my truest calling. The wound that nearly destroyed me became the source of my greatest strength.